Hello BookTube, it is very nearly the end of November, so I'm going to do my November D&D wrap up. So that's Delights, Discoveries and Disappointments, but it really is only Delights and Discoveries this month. It was a disappointment-free month. Most things I've read this month were kind of like solid 4-star sort of books, I suppose, if we're going to go down the rating road, and 2 were real 5-star delights. So let's start with those 2. First one was The Enlightenment of the Green Gage Tree by Shukufeh Azar. That's a novel, first novel by an Iranian-Australian author, and I've done a whole video talking about that. And so I won't say more here now, other than to say, if you're not put off by magical realism as a style in a book, then do have a think about reading that book. I thought it was great, but I also kind of recognised that it isn't a book that would appeal to everybody, if that makes sense. But I've done a whole video about it, so if that does appeal, go and have a look and make up your own mind if you might like to read it. But my second highlight book of this month is a book, a non-fiction choice, which was kind of for non-fiction November, and that's Unspeakable, the story of Junius Wilson by Hannah Joyner and Susan Burch. And one of the delights of reading this book is that Hannah is Hannah of Hannah's Books, one of our fellow booktubers, and the other delight, I suppose, about it was that I was reading it with as a group read with some other booktubers, Sean and Brian and Alba and Justin, and that it's a really enriching experience to read a good book with a group of thoughtful and insightful readers. So thank you guys for that. Why was it such a good read? Okay, I think Unspeakable is, it's got all the qualities of my absolute favourite non-fiction book. So thing number one, impeccable scholarship. You know, everything in it is soundly based on good research. It's all referenced. You don't have to worry about, oh, is this solid? It's all there. So that's thing number one. Thing number two, lovely, fluid writing style, not in your face, but appropriate to the material. That's thing number two. Thing number three is it has a really kind of strong narrative to it. I really enjoy non-fiction where you're kind of carried along in the way that you might be in a novel, even though it's non-fiction. That you know what I mean, don't you? Yeah, I'm sure you do. Honestly, this book, if I hadn't been doing it as a group read with a kind of like, we'll do 3 chapters each week and we'll talk to each other about it on Sunday, honestly, I think I would have read it in a matter of just like 2 or 3 days, because I was so sort of pulled along by the story. Yeah. And that brings me to the sort of the fourth element of why it's my kind of non-fiction book, and that's the subject matter is absolutely fascinating. But also, it's this thing, now I've got to put this into words, you know, when a non-fiction book kind of homes in on the micro, yeah, you know, a small detail or the specifics, yeah, and uses that sort of micro to also really illuminate something much wider, something on the macro scale. So Unspeakable is, as it says, the story of Junius Wilson, and so it's one man's life, and this man Junius was in 1925. He, as a young deaf black American, was accused of a sexual assault, never convicted, but was sent to what was, I can't remember, it had some awful title, as things did in those days, like the state asylum for coloured lunatics or something dreadful like that. Later became called Cherry Hospital. So he was sent there in 1925 as a boy, really, not yet even a man, and he never left. Although he was given a measure of freedom in old age after some vigorous sort of campaigning by some people, including family members, essentially he spent most of the 20th century as a prisoner in a mental hospital. And as a deaf man, he was then cut off from all communication really with people, because no one signed. People didn't. He was. They eventually kind of concluded that he was never had really any sort of mental health condition. He was just deaf, and I mean it is an unspeakable story, and we're carried along by the story of his life. But what the book does through the life of Junius Wilson is just pick up on so many sort of 20th century issues, American issues, but wider even than that. So, racism, in particular, sort of Jim Crow kind of segregation in the American South. But, more broadly, attitudes to, I suppose, disability rights, deaf identity, sort of that process of change over the decades, and yet his life barely changes. Really wonderful book, strongly recommend it. I expect some of the others will do more about it as well. So, rest of the month's reading was all good, solid, enjoyable, but not matching up to those two, if that makes sense. I read some other books for non-fiction in November. One was White Fragility, and by DiAngelo. Now that was a discovery, I suppose, because it's a book that lots of people have recommended to me, and I read it thinking, oh, will this tell me kind of things I already know? No, absolutely not. What was interesting for me and valuable, useful about this book is that it's actually a book written by a white author addressing white readers to help us examine our intrinsic racism. White Fragility, it's about the way as white people we may be well intentioned and even feel that we are anti-racist, but we can't get away from the sort of sociological and psychological kind of forces that mean we're intrinsically racist and advantaged by being white. What was particularly good about the book, I think, is that because the author works as like a diversity trainer, she just had such a range of examples to illustrate what she's talking about from the training, I suppose, that she does. And what she illustrates beautifully and really rang true for me is the way people on a sort of in principle broad level, oh yes, very right thinking about issues around sort of race and so on, but when they're individually challenged, when we are individually challenged about something that we've said or we've done, that then the defensiveness comes in, you know, and that's the sort of the white fragility that she's referring to. So really useful book. Useful for me because I'm embarking with some others in my organisation at looking at how we shift our charity to address some of these issues better as an organisation. You know, we work with families of disabled children, and I think we've always said, oh yes, and we must do outreach to make sure that parents of colour feel, you know, hear what a wonderful service we are and want to use us. And what I would understand now is that actually what we need to do is change the organisation so that it's not about us reaching out, it's about us changing so that parents of disabled children who are people of colour see us as an organisation that they want to use. If that, yeah, that makes sense, doesn't it? Yeah. Anyway, that was that. The weakness of that book, and you know, is sort of not. No, I don't think it's childish to say this. Is that because she's a trainer, not a writer, really. I think she almost structures it like a training session. So she tells you what she's going to tell you, then she tells you it with examples and opportunities to kind of practice, and then she tells you what she's told you, which is a really good way to do a training session, but not as good for a book, because with a book you can go back and forth. So that would be my one kind of criticism of it, but yeah, it's trivial. Put that to one side. The fourth book for non-fiction in November is the one thing I haven't yet finished this month, and that's All the Tea in China, and I will, yeah, I'll soon finish that off, I hope. I've got 2 other buddy reads or group reads that I've done this month, and both of which were really enjoyable. One was with Tilly of Tilly's Shelf, and it was our discussing drama play this month, and that was 1001 Nights. So it's by a Lebanese author. There's a video about it on Tilly's channel, so I won't talk about it here. The other is Paradise Lost, which is a kind of long-running buddy read that I'm doing with Madeleine and Stephanie and Alan, and that is very definitely a delight and will eventually be undoubtedly a 5-star read. You know, I already know that, but I'm not going to finish it this month. It's more of a slow burn, that one. Then the last 2 books I'm going to quickly talk about that I read this month, both of which were solidly good books, were the books I read for Indigathon. Now, Indigathon is a readathon to encourage us to read books by Indigenous American Canadian authors, but also Indigenous authors from other countries. And so I did one American one and one from New Zealand. The American one was Love Medicine by Louise Erdrich, and if you don't already know Louise Erdrich, I bet you do. Most of you watching this probably do, but if you don't, you should, because she's a really first-rate writer. I've read a few of her books now. They've all been good. She's kind of Chippewa heritage, and Love Medicine was her first book, and it's set on a reservation in North Dakota, and she wrote it in 1984, I think, and it's kind of a multiple narrators story that pulls together. It kind of takes place over 50 years. We don't get it exactly in chronological order, but it kind of gradually builds and comes together, and you start out a bit befuddled as to who all these people are and how they're related to each other. And honestly, I wished I had some sort of family tree to make sense of it all, about people's relationships. But as the book goes on, it kind of comes together, and you get the whole life of the community really through kind of like members of 2 families. She has subsequently written 3 more books in the same kind of, set on the same reservation with the same kind of families intertwining, and I'm going to have to read the other 3 eventually. But yeah, a goodie. The other one the book from New Zealand was The Imaginary Lives of James Poneke by Tina Makareti, and that's a book from 2018, and she's a Maori author. What an interesting book. Quite different. Single narrator, kind of first person protagonist. He was he's orphaned in the musket wars of the early 19th century in New Zealand. So like the Europeans introduced firearms to New Zealand when they arrived, and the obviously, you know, exciting new weapon, people took it up, and then but that gave a whole new kind of flavour, I suppose, to the sort of intertribal Maori conflicts that then played out in a very kind of bloody way, which of course then kind of opened up opportunities for those European colonists to take over chunks of New Zealand. Smart that was, wasn't it? Anyway, we get the kind of picaresque story of his childhood, youth. He winds up learning English because he's living with missionaries at one stage, and then we go with him from New Zealand to London as a kind of teenage boy, and he basically goes there hoping to kind of get an education, which he kind of does, but in exchange, the deal, in effect, is that he acts as a living exhibit in an art exhibition by the artist who brings him from New Zealand and who's done sort of pictures of New Zealand and has New Zealand artifacts, and he's like the most exciting artifact, James, in this exhibition. So it's one of those books that she's setting out to do big themes. You know, she wants to write about colonialism and racism and what does it mean to be civilized or savage, you know, and how do we see the other or ourselves. He's a great kind of wide-eyed, naive narrator who grows and experiences things and comes to understand better what is happening to him. Really vivid descriptions of New Zealand in the early to mid 19th century. Really, even more in a way, vivid descriptions of Victorian London through the eyes of James, who comes at it sort of all starry-eyed to start with, and then is a really interesting observer, I suppose, of the Victorian English. The way I'm talking about it, you'd think it might have been a 5-star read, but the reason it wasn't, I think, is because there's something about the characterization in the book that didn't 100% work for me, but not enough to not enjoy the book as a whole, but just didn't quite hit the sort of top spot. So that was my November, full of goodies, in fact. And so what were your highlights of your November? Do say. And have you read any of these books? If so, tell me what you thought of them. Agree or disagree with me, or add to the discussion. And roll on December.